Hey there. Welcome to the Joyful Rebels podcast. We've got Claire and Donna here, and we're excited this week to be tackling a new topic, which is imposter syndrome. So, I want to back it up just a second with a quick
Mhm.
announcement. If you have not yet, we've got our YouTube channel up and running, and there are our videos of our podcast there, which are pretty fun to watch, if I do say so myself. We've also got lots of yoga videos up there, and I want to plug the beginners classes. So if you are brand new to yoga and maybe a little bit intimidated about just showing up at a yoga studio and walking in a class, you want to build some basics. Or if you have an established practice, but you want to, again, brush up on some of those fundamentals, I've started a beginner's yoga series. So again, checking out our YouTube channel that you can get to from thejoyfulrebels.com or search up the Joyful Rebels on YouTube. We've got these 30-minute beginner series yoga classes and I've gotten really great feedback on it. So definitely check those out. Second thing, if you remember our format, I want to remind you that this week we've got a new topic. So again, imposter syndrome, which it's funny because I sound excited to talk about, but I think that since day one of this podcast, this is the topic I've been waiting for, like the one I relate to the most. Like, yes, this is me. Uh, so, you who are listening, a reminder that what we're going to do is talk about what this topic is, who's maybe experiencing it, how it shows up, and then what you can do about it if it's showing up in your life. So as you're listening, you're going to start to notice, okay, is this showing up in my life? And when you hear these tips we're talking about towards the end of the episode, you're going to pick, okay, which one am I digging this week? I'm going to try this out so that when we all get together next week and
Mhm.
talk about our reflections on this topic, you'll be able to use that time and space as well to reflect on how it showed up for you. So, just that quick reminder that we are all in this thing together. We are all working through these things together, and it's just the cool, joyful rebels community. So, welcome again. Thanks for listening, and let's get into this topic. Imposter syndrome. Have you ever asked yourself or thought, am I really worthy of the success that I have? Have you ever had words in your head like, "Ugh, I'm undeserving of this, I'm incompetent," or maybe like you're fooling everyone? Like, oh my gosh, people think I'm doing this great job. I don't know why they think that. I'm not good enough to be doing this. In 2018, a definition came out of imposter syndrome. And actually, the topic first was talked about in the research and the psychological research in the 1970s. But definition: imposter syndrome is a form of self doubt and a false belief that you're not as confident and capable as others perceive you to be. Maybe you have difficulty internalizing your success. And who tends to experience this? Well, I'm raising my hand. I'm raising both hands here because I feel like that's me. Mom, you're raising your hand.
Yep.
What we do tend to see in the research is that this does mostly affect women, and not just women, but high achieving women. So it's almost like like you're scratching your head, but it tends to be women with some degree of success, with different backgrounds in their education, with good professional experience. So successful, well educated, good work experience, feeling this imposter syndrome, feeling almost like a fraud, like, oh, I'm fooling other people. Why do they think that I'm so great
Mhm.
at these things? Feeling inadequate, that self doubt. So again, it shows up mostly in women, in high achieving women. Now, I will note research shows that this effect can be even more prominent in women of color,
Mhm.
in those communities and people of color. And out of all these high achievers, the numbers show about 25 to 30% will suffer from imposter syndrome often. About 70% of adults in general will experience it at some point in their life. So I would like to meet those 30% of the people who never feel this way. But it is, when I look at that statistic, for me, it's a little bit comforting to know that I'm not the only person that feels that way. So we know that it's affecting high achieving women with these diverse backgrounds, with good experience, to still feel some doubt. So, what are some signs that you're experiencing this? Well, you might fear that you're not living up to expectations. It might cause you to overwork, take on more work, or maybe you're an overachiever. maybe you're self-sabotaging yourself because you don't trust yourself with a new opportunity. And we actually have a whole episode on self-defeating behavior like that, season 2, episode 16, if that's something that calls out to you, or episode 6, excuse me. But why is this bad? Again, if we remember talking about approval seeking behavior, that's when you're looking externally for some validation. So the same thing is happening with this imposter syndrome, is that you're feeling this distress and this guilt. You might be stifling your growth, or it's stopping you from pursuing opportunities because you have this fear that other people, oh, they think I'm great but I'm not. So again, this is something that I have experienced just throughout my academic career, throughout my professional career. I find comfort to know that I'm not the only one. What do you think about that, Mom?
Oh, I think it's so prevalent, and it's when it's quiet and we don't bring it to the surface, then I think it just festers like other toxic things. And as you're speaking, I'm, inspired that I made a connection of, some of it too. I remember growing up getting the message of, I don't want to be boastful.
Mm.
So the opposite of being boastful, as my little brain interpreted it, was not being humble or having language around that, or generous, or other ways to show up in the world. It was to undermine what I felt or did, or whatever. And who knows, Claire, maybe I even passed that on to you guys as we're growing up, just because that's what was given to me. And that was specifically because I was a girl. Like my brother didn't get that. Like, so some of that is we get handed. Sometimes we're further along the race of being entrenched in a certain behavior or a mindset. And that's because we were encouraged to be that way. But then once you know more, you can do better. So some of that is, or do differently. That I like that. I like that better. So but some of it is that was a female thing. And so no wonder that we are struggling with that as a gender and as a group of people, just trying to understand ourselves. And we also are much more, we're in roles that that have success tied to them. It's not like there's, being at home and raising a family is the hardest job. I'm 100% convinced. You're raising the next generation, or, being in a relationship or running a household. I mean, that's like a whole business by itself, just doesn't pay great. But if we're out in the workforce in a paying job, then now we're being judged. Now there are parameters on how to say what's successful and what is not. And we've been in it long enough to have many opportunities to succeed, and then to not really own that internally. So I think it's just where we're falling on the historical timeline, that we're uncovering that this is still a thing. We are in lots of situations where it shows up. And I think that's really interesting. And who knows what the conversation will look like in 25 years. 10 years, 5 years, who knows? But the more we talk about it now, the more we can be aware of it and see if we can combat that and own the things that we do that is accurate, honest, celebratory, and authentic.
Yeah, I definitely agree that some of these things, I mean, we talked about that it's affecting women, and I think that there's so much to unpack there in terms of
Hmm.
what societal expectations of women, and especially then women in the workplace. Uh, I do also think that imposter syndrome is not, going to be the same, experienced the same way by all of us. And we found some really interesting resources that I'm going to share in the show notes. But some of it talks about the different types of imposter syndrome that we might experience. And Mom, I think you're going to elaborate a little more on that, because when I saw this, I was like, yes, yes, yes.
And so we debrief before we get on and talk, but and even texting back and forth with Claire was like, oh, this one's mine. Some of these may land with a welcome thud, I'll put it that way. And so, ears open, listeners, that I think the way to try to interpret the 5 ways that imposter syndrome can show up in us is to really be honest and just look at it through truthful eyes and go, that one's me, or that one tends to show up as me. Because truly that's not your essence, but I'll just use that as a term like, yep, I identify with that one the most, and see if there's a primary one. Maybe there'll be a secondary one, but it's okay in our quiet moments to go, yeah, I think this is where my starting point is. So the first one of the 5 is the perfectionist. And I'm guessing that's no surprise to anyone that's listening. However, it shows up so incredibly much. I wonder if you would agree with that. But the perfectionist is really just fixates on the flaws, which is easy to do. We've talked on several times about negativity bias and how our brains are hardwired to attach to the thing that might be a safety issue for us. But, hearing a negative comment isn't really a safety issue unless we're talking about psychological safety. So, the way that we're divinely built and the society and the world that we live in now, we can come at odds with how our brain works. But the cool thing is that through neuroplasticity, we actually get a chance to change how we think about some things. And I love that it's where I identify now, and maybe you too, it's not a stuck or fixed place. So we're just talking about where we are today as you're listening to this. So the perfectionist, you can hear the flaws and not like some of the good stuff in, which is why we always start coaching sessions with wins. We're going to break that pattern by talking about the good stuff. We'll get into more of that later, but notice the small and big ways that perfectionism can infiltrate the way that we see ourselves, because we're holding ourselves to a standard that is impossible. You wouldn't do that to your best buddy. You wouldn't hold them to that, but somehow that still has tentacles to us. So perfectionistic, perfectionism, that is one that shows up. The second one, we'll call it the natural genius. And those can be people that maybe already have a really high IQ, or that they have really a specific skill set. But because they have specific skill sets and maybe they're quick learners, that doesn't mean that everything comes easily. It doesn't, because then when they go to learn something new, if they don't grasp it right away, then they're like, well, maybe I don't have this natural tendency. And I got to be honest, when I first looked at this, Claire, I thought of you, and not from an imposter syndrome, but natural genius, and knowing just you're brilliant. And if the guys listening, like, she is brilliant. She has been since she came out of the womb, and is just this super smart person that learned everything. But that doesn't mean that you didn't have to work to learn new things. And I think even as a parent that I could have thought, I don't remember consciously doing it, but like, this will come easy to you, you're going to be fine. When that's not really fair, because it needs to go on a task by task, or one subject matter at a time. It's not like everything. I love that I've been in fitness for 30 some years. And so because I can do a burpee, I've had people go, well, you can play golf really well too, right? I'm like, oh no, that's a different skill set. I would have to learn that all the way over again. So not to discount that someone who might learn things easily does not have to learn everything easily. And it goes by a subject by subject basis. So we can be disappointed if we're not grasping this new information like we do some other stuff. So you've got the perfectionist, you've got natural genius. The third one is the soloist. That one landed in my heart with a thud that had ripples of dust that popped up. I think I texted you on that one. I was like,
Yeah.
that's the one. That's the person that has trouble asking others for help. And I'm wondering who's listening to this right now that again, in the quiet moments, or maybe not in the quiet moments, maybe even we've worn it as a badge of honor. I can do this. I can muscle through. And even when I need it the most, I don't ask for help, or I hadn't asked for help. I got to say I do now. Because what I'm starting to learn, this is an offshoot of that, is that when I say yes and somebody wants to help me, they get something out of it too. And I was denying that. I was stopping that reciprocal energy loop and feedback loop and connection loop. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that. And then guess what? When I got help, there are people that are better at things than I am, that have more bandwidth. And when I finally started realizing that we are all connected and that it's not up to me to just muscle through life, I'm watching this sunset. But I would say 100% that the soloist, that the person who has trouble asking others for help, especially when you really, really need it, that would be absolutely an imposter place. Okay, so we're moving on. We got a couple more. How about the expert? that even if you have decades of experience and you have lived in a space of understanding about, biology or parenting, parents, this could be a place for us because we're in it often, and you are experts to a certain extent because you are figuring it out, you're doing a great job, but you feel like you're just never quite good enough. Like the phrase that I wrote in my notes was, when you have that realization of the more you know, the less you know,
Mm, mhm.
where you're like, oh, like, I thought I kind of had a handle on this, or you're dealing with subjects and topics that have moving finish lines where there's new information, just like what we're doing right now, is that there's new research that's coming out all the time that is either supporting a different path of understanding and allowing another one to not be relevant anymore. So being an expert can be, maybe that's where the boastful thing came up too. Like, I would not call myself an expert. That sounds like I'm bragging, but there's certain things that I do know how to do really well. And I wouldn't have called it expert, but there is a way to own what you know and own who you are. And it's funny that even when we have, whether it's technical, academic, life experience, on the job experience, life experience, and we still can't say that at least at some point we are building our expertise. So then it just feels like we're not even allowing ourselves to say, I do have mastery in some things, not everything. And I can do that humbly, but no, like, I'm going to own that. I do know how to do that. Like, I've recently come to realize I love doing like free seminars. I like to meet with people because being in person, or if you're watching on YouTube, hello, like, I like this. This is where I feel the most comfortable, is to be able to talk and make a connection. And I love that as a supplement to the digital work that we do. So I would never have said like I'm an expert in that, but I'm going to own that that is something I do really well. And are there other people that do it better? Sure. But then I look at them and I don't say like, what am I not doing right? I'm like, what are they doing well? And how does it look in me? So being an expert, but thinking that you don't ever know enough, that's one way that the imposter syndrome shows up. And then we've got one more, and that's called the super person. The super person is like, how about it? They just seem to always have so much on their plate and there's so much to do, and they're pushing way beyond what anybody would look at and like, that's nuts. That's a lot of stuff going on, or that's, and clearly we're looking through our lens, but they're pushing themselves past their limits, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. There's lots of different ways to do that. But if, rest and regrouping, and all the things that we do on the other side of pushing, when there is no balance, that super person is somebody that is an imposter. That is not sustainable. It's not even truthful in how people function. And because we expect so much of us, then we expect a lot of the people around us, and that's not fair. That's not fair. I've done that. And I can say I've done that where when I realized that if I felt I had this much to give and I've got my arms out in front of me, and then I would expect somebody else to have that, that's not fair. I mean, what that means is that I'm not connected. There needs to be a conversation. There needs to be a negotiation. Just let's get on the same page. Let's talk about it, instead of me just thinking if I'm doing all this work, everybody else should too. This is not cool. So if we review, we've got the perfectionist, the natural genius, the soloist, the expert, and the super person. Can you guys that are listening, can you pick, like, is this one just fly off? You're like, that's it for me. Or do you have one or two that are kind of lingering and kind of accelerate for, the first place in the race, depending on the situation? What do you think about that, Claire?
You know, Thank you for sharing all those. And, I had read the similar material, the same material you did, but as you're talking about it and putting some more texture around it, it's landing more with me. And so when you started talking about the first one, I'm having notes about, oh, this is how this shows up in my life. And then you get to the second one, I'm like, oh, wait. And so I will say, instead of going into all my notes here, this is this is my material. I'm going to plan to unpack and talk about this more next week when we reflect on it. Because I do think that either in different times in my life or different situations, I can relate to all these different things. And just to know, again, to have some words around it and know that this is a thing. Because again, like there's so, even when I think about imposter syndrome, or if I'm asked to do something, speak somewhere or collaborate with someone, and my first thought is, why me? Like, why would they pick me? I don't know anything. And then it's like, no, I do. And so instead of having these negative thoughts when I think about imposter syndrome, now I'm starting to think, oh no, this is a normal thing people are experiencing. And so if you're feeling the same as me, or again, if one or two popped out at you for the next week, see if you want to unpack that a bit. Where is this showing up? Because now we're going to move into when we talk about what we can do about it. And the first thing, I'm not even going to call this a tip, I'm going to call this
Nah.
a pre-tip. The pre-tip, which is now a universal tip for every single topic that we have moving forward. I'm just going to throw that, like, no caveats. I'm going to say this is every topic moving forward is awareness, is acknowledging that it's happening in your life, because you can't do any of the subsequent tips if you're not first noticing where it's showing up. So you just heard the 5 tips that my mom went through, or the 5 types, excuse me, that my mom went through. So you're going to think about, okay, how is this showing up in my life? You're going to observe, your thoughts. You're going to witness them, because once you do that, that's when you can make some change. Once you're aware, then you can challenge some of those thoughts. You can reassess why you're feeling these thoughts, or in what situations they're showing up. So the first true tip then that we're going to have is to consider the evidence. Let's look at this objectively, because there's going to be emotions tied up in there. If you think, again, those things that are popping up, oh, I'm not deserving of this, I'm unworthy, I'm incompetent, you're going to start to have these emotions tied to it. An emotional part of your brain is kind of has the reins there. We need to pull back into looking at the facts. And so what we're going to do is consider the evidence about you. You know your stuff, you know
Mhm.
what you're doing. And one of the ways that we can look back on this, and oh my gosh, I'm talking about it again, is this wins journal. Start to document and have in one place all the wins that you've had. I mean, and you can really branch out on this. Maybe you're feeling imposter syndrome when it comes to your career, your work. So maybe you have a section that's just devoted to the wins that you've had on the job, what your experience is. Because again, like, especially when we talked about something like perfectionism, maybe you're only focusing on one little mistake you made, when really you've done dozens and dozens of great things in the week, helping other people, shining your light, but you're just fixating on the one small thing that, again, maybe no one else even noticed. There's that spotlight syndrome where we think everyone's paying attention to us really closely, but they're not, which is something I have to talk to my kids about all the time. But let's focus, like, on purpose, intentionally focus on the things that you're doing good. Maybe it's checking some of those cognitive distortions, or what we talk about, those limiting beliefs. And if you
Mhm.
remember, when we talked about Joyful Rebels Explained in season 1, we said one of our main tenets was wanting to blast away these limiting beliefs that we have. So things like perfectionism are all or nothing. Oh, I can't do this completely perfectly. I can't do this all. Well, I'm not going to try it all, right? Because imposter syndrome, one of the downsides is it can stifle our growth, or cause us to not go after some of those opportunities that can be good for us. And another thing, when we're considering the evidence, I also want to throw in there to consider what your mindset is in the moment. Because if we can shift into positively focusing on something, so like mindset, and mom, I thought of this when you talked about that expert type of imposter syndrome, and how um, things might change in your field, or there's new information that might feel overwhelming. Yeah, if you have a fixed mindset, then you might think that new information or new things that are coming out in your field are scary, or make it so
Mhm.
that, oh, I don't know enough. Got to shift into that growth mindset. Oh, this is more information. Whoa, I can build my knowledge here. I can think about things a new way. I can make new connections. So, part of that reflection. So, when I say consider the evidence, that's the evidence of you, right? And part of that, I think, is what mindset are you in the moment? And if we can do things to shift into a mindset that's focused more on growth, acknowledge that you're going to make mistakes. Like,
Mhm.
and that is okay. Give yourself permission, especially trying something new. Like, expect mistakes, expect for things to go wrong. And it's tying into that perfectionism tendency again. But if you can go into situations, or if you're aware that you're experiencing this imposter syndrome, and be realistic about it and be objective about it, and try to switch off from that emotional brain that's got the reels, and say, no, here are some things that I've done that demonstrated that I
Mhm.
know what I'm talking about. I realize that I am looking at this from a negative or a fixed mindset. So I am going to on purpose shift into or try to shift into looking at this more positively. And it might feel weird to do that. I would honestly say when I try that this week, I'm going to say it out loud. I'm noticing that I'm feeling this way. I'm going to try to focus on moving this way, and maybe it's difficult in the moment, and sometimes I'll be totally honest, you can't just say mind think a different way. That's when it can be good, like side tip, to get into your body a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe you go for a 10-minute walk, maybe you do a box breathing exercise for 3 minutes, and then you review this situation that you've noticed is causing you to feel this certain way. So considering your evidence is one, and reiterating to yourself how awesome you are is one way to combat this imposter syndrome. What do we got for
Wow.
our next tip?
Well, I gotta just piggyback on that a little bit. Um, what'd you just say about considering, shoot, I had such a good point and it left the building. I'll come back to it. But the things that you're saying, oh, getting into your body.
Yeah.
Remembering though that after you move, your brain is receptive to hearing a new message, whether it's learning new material or talking to yourself, like that's when you're open to it. And so that has so much merit in just getting out and moving a little bit. And even the box breathing, you're changing your physiology just slightly. And so that shakes you out. Cause you're right. It's naive to think that I could just be like, I'm just going to think differently.
Right.
Great. If that works for you, I would love for you to reach out and let me know what that is. Cause I don't think that's the norm. But we do still have the capability and the influence to move our bodies, to set up our physiology and then our psychology in order to hear messages that are different, as long as we're aware and we have our eyes on that so that we have a focal point. And so that we're the driver. So I love that. It's not the emotional stuff. I want to get it into more objective where I can make a decision instead of just reacting. So that was a great point that almost sailed, and yet I found it. Okay. There is, a really big one here that we want to just kind of bring it all home with, is that you really can share your feelings with others too. And the being able to work on it and is a way to, first we're thinking about it, but then to be able to let that go from brain out through your mouth to, a trusted friend, to be able to talk about it a little bit, because a little bit of camaraderie does go a long way. It really does. We are in this together. That's why we're doing it too. That's why it's not like us just saying, you guys do this. It's like, we are in here with you. We're doing it too. We're experimenting, finding things that work and don't. We have two different generations, so you can see what it can look like. This is, we're having different experiences, even though we're in the same subject matter. So we hope that you do find that helpful, but know that we're all in it together. And when we're in it together, then there's less doubt of like, wow, is it just me? And that
Mm.
isolated piece then is just not helpful, because we are connected. And there's plenty of research about when we know that we are connected to other people, we can elevate our collective mood and actually happiness and set ourselves up for success, because you have more wind at your back instead of feeling like you're just kind of cut from the herd. And then also when I'm talking to somebody and sharing and working on it, then what happens is I can get feedback, whether am I even setting realistic goals? I mean, you just get an idea, you get context for what you're thinking. Because sometimes when I'm thinking something, it can be unrealistic. And if it's unrealistic, then it would be unrealistic for anybody, not just me, but other people. So that's useful to get that opinion from somebody else. And we've talked about it before. It's not like 100 people, got a couple trusted people that I will talk to. But the overall arc of that for me, you guys, is what inspired me when I'm looking over this material is, let's elevate the conversations when we talk to other people just in general. And by that, I mean, talking about something that could potentially be categorized as negative could easily slide into venting, gossiping, it could feel more negative and unproductive. That's okay. We can live in the same space of something that may be uncomfortable or not super, doesn't seem popular in the moment. We can still stay in that space and have a conversation without it devolving. So I just think even if we're just talking as women, we can have better conversations. And we can be the drivers of better conversations that will be helpful for our understanding, for the people in our orbit, And so then that way, like an ink blot, it just spreads out because we're just having conversations that don't need to get into nitty gritty and punitive landscape. I want to be in topics and talk about things and think about things that are productive, that increase my awareness, that allow me to grow in every stage of my life, not from before, now I'm done. And I want to stay connected to other people because we're having this collective shared experience and we've got resources that we can share with each other. So that's a lot. What do you think about all that, Claire?
Yeah, I really like what stuck out with me is when you said the phrase elevating the conversation. And I remember you saying a few weeks ago about being able to share good news with a friend and how that can change the whole uh, landscape of the conversation instead of just negative venting, which again, that might have its place and its space, but we can do more. We can use conversation and connection to build those positive feelings. So if you're listening, you know what you got to do for the next week. Number one, you're going to notice, and maybe it's super obvious and you're like, this is showing up for me, or maybe it's something there you got to dig a little bit. Either way is okay. Then you're going to think about those 5 types of imposter syndromes that we talked about and see which one lands with you. Because it's interesting to know where we're at right now. It's part of your awareness, which again is that universal or pre tip that we gave. So you're going to say, how does this show up in my life? Where and when does this show up in my life? And then you're going to pick what you're going to do about it. Maybe plan it out. Maybe you'll get a chance to do it, whether it's putting some wins in your wins journal, whether it's really facing and confronting some of these limiting beliefs that are popping up in your life, or at least giving it a name and noticing it. Because again, awareness, first step to making change. And then you're going to elevate your conversations. And again, finding those people that you trust to share your feelings. If you are experiencing these feelings of imposter system, share it. Have a conversation about it. Because I'm going to guess more than likely the person that you're talking to has experienced it too. So please join us next week when we're going to reflect on imposter syndrome. It's your space to reflect on it too. And please, if you haven't already, check out thejoyfulrebels.com. It's our new platform. We've got videos there. We've got all of our podcasts. We've got a blog and we've got an online program. So it's our one-stop Joyful Rebels shop. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Till next time, Rebels.